I'm very pleased tonight to introduce Britteny Cioni, and she is from the University of Alaska Southeast. And one of the things that our sponsor has enabled us to do is to bring speakers to Fairbanks from other places to represent a broader view of all the exciting research that's going on within the University of Alaska system. Ms. Cioni has been pursuing her graduate studies. She's earned a master's degree from the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville, and she is currently pursuing a doctoral degree from the Colorado State University. She tells me that she has everything done but her dissertation, and she hopes to get that completed this summer, and so we're all rooting for her on that one. She does some very interesting research in the field of economics. She works on something called gender economics, which I wasn't actually aware that this existed until I read her resume. And she also works in the field of economic development and environmental economics. The particular presentation that she's going to give today has to do with the economics of climate change, and this is something that I think I've always been involved in the scientific research related to climate change, but I think this is an area that hasn't been sufficiently considered when we are concerned about what the effects of climate change might be. So without further ado, I'll introduce Britteny Cioni.
Thank you. Hi, welcome this evening. I'm glad you guys made it out. I know it's not cold to you, but it still feels cold to me. So anyway, so I am at the University of Alaska Southeast, as it's been said, and currently trying to finish my doctorate degree at Colorado State University. One of the things I think that none of what's really being presented tonight is my own original research, but it's a review of the current literature that's available. And one of the things that I found is unlike a lot of economists, I won't talk over your head tonight, or I'll try not to, at least anyway. And I'll be able, hopefully, to present the ideas and the topics behind some of environmental economics and, in particular, climate change to you this evening from the kind of social science or the environmental standpoint. And I agree there's been a lot of kind of the hard science work done on this, and now we're starting to get into some of the socioeconomic impacts. So that's a picture of Mendenhall Glacier, which is our largest glacier in Juneau, and that was taken this summer, and it is receding currently, as most glaciers are. And as you can see, the rock that's there to the left was at one time covered. This is an ice cave, also at Mendenhall Glacier, and if you can't tell, it's dripping. So it was the summer when I was out there, and it is actually dripping as it's melting. And one of the distinctive features of climate change and the climate problem that we're currently facing is this really long time horizon, and that gets very difficult to deal with. Also, we have a lot of uncertainty surrounding this problem, which doesn't help. The international scope of the issue adds difficulty, and the uneven distribution of policy benefits and costs across both space and time. So it is a challenging problem. So this is one of my jokes for this evening, but this was Juneau last winter, and it sure doesn't look like it's getting warmer. That was we had about 200 inches of snow in Juneau last winter. We broke the record. If you've been in Fairbanks, I guess the last week or so, it most certainly doesn't feel warmer. I think we'd all probably hoping for a little local warming. But one of the things with climate change is we're probably not necessarily going to feel it right away. It's, like I said, a very long time horizon. And sometimes things just get stranger, maybe not necessarily warmer. It's going to depend upon kind of where you are, what the impacts are going to be. Global temperatures have increased 0.6 degrees Celsius over the past 100 years globally. The rate of temperature increase, when we break it down from 1976 to present, has been double that from that increase that we experienced from 1910 to 1945. So it's getting warmer, and it's getting warmer faster as we go over, as we increase in time. In Alaska, the overall state temperature has risen 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit, and wintertime temperatures have risen 6 degrees Fahrenheit. So I wanted to start out with the definition of sustainable development. And I originally put this lecture together, one of the things we were talking about was sustainability. And I think it's still important. The most widely used definition is development, which meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And this comes out of the Brundtland Commission in 1987. And economic development is an important macroeconomic goal. But we need to consider both the direct and the indirect impacts of our development process. Direct impacts are going to be things like job creation, reduction in poverty, and those have for a long time been considered, and that's how we've measured the success of our economic development. But our indirect impacts really haven't garnered a lot of attention. And indirect impacts are going to be things like environmental degradation and distributional issues that oftentimes are much harder to measure and consider. Much of our current development that's going on, both within the US and globally, does not meet this definition. And climate change is only going to make it even harder to meet the definition. So we're not currently meeting, and it's probably just going to get harder to meet as we move forward. Economics, I tell my principal students, is about trade-offs. And we really need to start considering the trade-offs of things like economic development, especially when we're looking at issues like climate change. All right, climate change is our greatest and widest ranging market failure that we have ever seen, is how it's been termed. This comes out of the Stern Review, which is a British report. It's the largest, current, most comprehensive report on economics of climate change to date. Market failure occurs when the market fails to produce a socially efficient outcome. And from an economist standpoint, markets work really great when there is a condition. All of our costs and all of our benefits that we're receiving from those goods and services that we're producing and trading are accounted for. If we don't have that, then what we typically end up with is this market failure. And a lot of our environmental services aren't traded in formal markets. They don't have formal prices, and therefore they get very difficult to define and to value and to quantify. So market failures. We have four main types that we typically look at in economics, and that's externalities, public goods and common resources, monopoly power, and then asymmetrical information. And so when a market is left to itself and it does not allocate resources efficiency, then we've said we have this market failure. And when we do have market failure, that is justification for intervention into the market through collective or government action. And externalities, I'm going to try and just give a kind of brief little overview of what these are. Externalities are when we have kind of third-party impacts. So if we have a factory that's dumping in the river and you are downstream of that river, you really didn't take place in making that those production decisions, but you're going to pay that cost because you're going to now have to clean up your water before you can drink it. Okay? And that is a cost that's being incurred by you, a third party, and you did not have any influence on that production decision. So that's when we have an externality. Public goods are going to be things like national defense, national parks. When they're left to the private market, they will not be provided in an adequate amount. The socially efficient is usually how we call that amount. Basically because you can't exclude people from using a public good. And so if you look at something maybe like public radio, where you can listen to it even if you don't pay for it. These are our types of public goods. Common resources I'm going to talk about in just a minute because that's really what our climate change falls under. Market power really is that monopoly power. In Juneau, I have a great monopoly example because Alaska Airlines is the only way to fly in commercially to Juneau. And so the problem with that is that then that monopoly tends to be able to reduce quantity and raise prices, and that's bad for our consumers. It just is a distortion of power within that marketplace. And then the last one is asymmetrical information. This occurs when any one party in a transaction has more information than the other party or parties. And that creates uncertainty. One party then can absolutely garner more power in that transaction also. So let's look at common resources, because this is really kind of what we're talking about with our atmosphere. And common resources are open access resources, and they typically experience what we call the tragedy of the commons. Tragedy of the commons is a classic example, or our classic example. We see it in other areas, but the classic example that gets used is with medieval grazing lands. And what happened in medieval Europe prior to the enclosure movement is that we would have a common grazing field where anyone could put their animals on to graze. Next to that, we might have a piece of private property. What ends up happening is that private property will be nice and lush and green, and that common property tends to get overused. It gets overgrazed and tends to end up being a field of dirt. Okay. The thing with that private property is that private owner gets to garner all rewards from that use of that property, and therefore they have an incentive to conserve. But with a common property, it's kind of like a rush to get to it first and who can use it. Because if you don't use it first, your neighbor will, and then they will get the rewards and reap the benefits from that. So market failures can arise when we have too many people using the resource. As you can see from this, our climate change falls into this. We basically have lots of people using the atmosphere. It's typically a non-marketed good. There's no way to really trade clean air at this point in time. And so we have this open access to this resource, and so we're getting overuse for it. For most of human history, this has not been a problem because our population has been small enough that we've had a relatively minor impact. But that is no longer the case as we're seeing. All right. We look at developing institutions in order to control such things. Like I said before, this is, even from a mainstream economist standpoint, this is justification for intervention into a marketplace. Oh, no, I'm on the right slide. Thought I was a slide behind. All right. So common air resources, so we're looking particularly at our atmosphere in this. First off, it lacks a market. Like I said previously, we don't have a formal market in which we trade that air resource. So since we're not really buying and selling air, we don't really have a value then to place on this service, this environmental service. There may be different types of emissions, and they probably are coming from a variety of sources. So it gets to be really difficult, potentially even impossible to track who is using that resource, okay? Who's actually putting that pollution out. So if we think about it, and this is what an economist would call non-point source pollution, which means that it's really difficult to track. We don't have like a pipe coming out. We might have a smokestack, that would be a point source. But the thing is that we also have lots of other sources for this type of pollution. Cars, we've got power plants, factories, buildings, okay, so lots of things that are impacting this. So it's a very complex issue is what we end up. We also have very large transaction costs, and a transaction cost is just a cost that's incurred during the process of buying and selling. The more number of parties you have, the larger your transaction cost. It's kind of like an organizational cost, okay? And it makes things more difficult the larger the number of parties, and the larger, therefore, your transaction costs are. Also, we find that our potential impacts of climate change are kind of public in nature. And when we have things that are public in nature, we have to have that collective action to correct for them. If we don't have clearly delineated enforceable rights, then individuals cannot easily bargain in markets, and therefore we have to have some sort of other party coming in to do that. And one of the things with air is not only do you have to be able to delineate that right, but you have to be able to enforce it. If you can't enforce a regulation, you might as well not bother. So I'm an economist. I have to have a graph or I'll get kicked out of the profession. So here is my graph for this lecture. In this graph, we're really trying to look and demonstrate overuse or overproduction when there's a market failure, like this common resource, or if we have an externality. And if we look at this, see if I can bring up this mouse so I can point. Hold on, okay. Our supply here is our market supply. So for anyone who has had principles of economics, or you've probably heard the terms even if you haven't had a formal class on it, this is going to be what gets supplied into our market. And we can kind of use this as a proxy for our, we'd call it our marginal private cost of production. So it's what it's going to cost our firms to produce this good. Our demand then is our marginal benefit of consumption. It's what we would get, what kind of benefit we would derive from consuming that good as that consumer. When we have an external cost or something like a common property resource, we've got a cost that's not really being accounted for in our marketplace. Our typical example of this is pollution. Then we're going to have a difference between what's optimal for society, or our marginal social cost, and what gets experienced in our private free market without any regulation. And when that happens, then we get this difference between what's socially optimal, what is optimal for us as a society as a whole, and what we're going to actually end up with, which is our market outcome, given that we don't have any intervention into this marketplace. Okay? And so you'd see we'd be better off if we actually produce less of this good, probably because we're having pollution that's not really getting accounted for in our marketplace. The other thing I have to have, because I'm an economist, is an equation. So I'm going to make it fairly simple, though. What we like to do is create production functions. And that tells us how much output we can get for our inputs. So we have these inputs, we turn them into goods and services. How many goods and services do we get for that? And a typical production function usually consisted of capital and labor. And that's all an economist would look at. Now this comes from the Stern Review. Again, that's the Economics of Climate Change. It's our most comprehensive to date view of this subject. And so they have included environmental quality, but for years we would never take that into consideration. We might have natural resources in there, and we might have our entrepreneur in there in addition to capital and labor, but that's it. We're not going to consider that environmental quality. But really, if you think about it, if we are using natural resources, and we typically do in most production processes, then we need to consider this. Because if we are having environmental degradation, and that is reducing or making it more difficult to acquire our natural resources, then that does impact our output level that we can produce with a given amount of inputs. And so we need to estimate market damages that are occurring from environmental degradation or climate change if we're looking at a particular problem. We do see this approach used oftentimes in forestry or agricultural models. Agriculture is our most environmentally sensitive sector. Non-market damages. So I said that a lot of these goods cannot be valued in a market. There's no formal market. We don't have these prices. And so since we don't have that, we don't have these prices to work with, it makes things very nice and easy for economists, let me tell you when we do though. We have to have some way. And so we look at trying different methods, and economists have a number of them, developed a number of different techniques in trying to estimate these values or potential kind of prices for our non-marketed goods. And we can look at travel cost method, which we usually do for recreation. We're going to see how much you'd pay to go to a site, and that's going to kind of input a little bit of a value to you. Hedonic pricing, we can value environmental amenities in an urban setting. We do that using housing prices and controlling for similar features, and then kind of weeding out through a number of statistical methods the value of that environmental amenity there. Contingent valuation, we use that as a survey technique, and so we're going to ask you what your willingness to pay might be to save or improve an environmental feature. all of these, and if you heard me say the word survey, you probably realize that has issues. All of these methods have problems that are inherent within them. But basically, at this point in time, it's the best we've got. So let's look at some of the impacts of climate change. And scientific evidence points to increasing risk of serious and potentially irreversible impacts from climate change, particularly associated with our business as usual paths for emissions, meaning we're just going to do the same that we've always been doing. We're not really going to make any major changes. So the annual flow of emissions is increasing. It's not likely to stay the same, particularly if you start getting into developing countries. We see fast-growing economies are investing in high-carbon infrastructure, and the demand for energy and transport, which are two of our largest sectors contributing to climate change, is increasing globally. There's at least a 77% chance, perhaps a 99% chance, depends on which model you use. Again, there's a lot of uncertainty, and so there's a lot of uncertainty still within our models. Our models are getting better, but we continue to refine them as we get more data. So between a 77 and a 99% chance of global average temperatures increasing in excess of 2 degrees Celsius. And this 2 degrees is going to come up as a kind of a critical measure, a critical point in one of my later slides. But we're probably going to get hotter than 2 degrees Celsius. Global impacts of climate change. Basically, we're going to see threats to most of those services that are important to life for people around the world. Melting glaciers will initially increase flood risk, and the other thing that they do is reduce water supplies. A number of parts of our world actually get their water off of glacier melt. We could see this threatening up to 1/6 of our world population. Declining crop yields could leave hundreds of millions without the ability to produce or purchase sufficient amount of food. 200 million people could become displaced because of rising sea levels, heavier floods, and more intense droughts. Cold-related deaths will decrease, so that's like the bright spot. The problem with that, though, is that we'll probably see an increase in deaths worldwide due to malnutrition and heat stress. So what we see is cold-related deaths go down, but heat-related deaths typically are predicted to go up. Malaria and other diseases will become more widespread. It's estimated 15 to 40% of the species will face extinction potentially after 2 degrees Celsius increase in temperature. And like I said previous, we're expected probably to get much hotter than that. The other thing with this is we have uneven distribution of our impacts. And what we consider typically to be our global south, which is our developing countries, they're at a geographic disadvantage. They're already hot, and now they're going to get hotter, and that does not help them any. Whereas if we get into more northern latitudes, potentially that rising increase in temperature can increase growing season and such, and could have some economic advantages. We're going to find that future warming will bring them high costs and few benefits. Developing countries are most often dependent largely on agriculture, and as I said previously, this is our most environmentally sensitive sector that we have in economics. Low incomes, both for people and for countries, increase their inability to deal with changing climates. They do not have the money or the resources to implement adaptation and mitigation programs, and I'll talk about those in a minute. The Stern report also does a summary of regional impacts for the United States, so I'd like to go over some kind of general U.S. impacts. Again, we could see potential short-term benefits in the north, but probably extensive damage in our south. Our U.S. is going to kind of mimic our global situation because, again, our southern states are much hotter. Short to medium term, the most costly impacts are expected to come from coastal flooding and extreme events like we saw with Katrina. Not necessarily attributing that to global climate change, but we'll probably see an increase in those types of events. What this means is we're going to need defensive infrastructure and investment, and what that does from an economic standpoint, if we're putting that into defensive measures, it's not going into productive measures. And so we're not really increasing our standard of living, we're really just trying to defend our standard of living against these extreme events. Changes in snowfall will likely affect water supply in the U.S., both along the Pacific coast and California, and the farmlands in the Mississippi Basin, because those tributaries are all fed by snowmelt. There will be a need for adaptation of crop varieties and planting times, and we're going to have to kind of refigure this out as our seasons extend. This does not, and we're looking at irrigation in a large part of our country for our agricultural sector, and that can also be impacted, particularly in our southeast and our southern Great Plains. Farm production is likely to shift northward above a 3 degrees Celsius increase. Total output is expected to fall somewhere between 5 and 20%. So again, we kind of have these thresholds that when we get above that, we're going to see our effects get more or increase. The North could benefit from lower energy bills. However, that gets offset by the South as they try and they see their energy bills going up as they're trying to cool themselves. More heat-related deaths again, fewer cold-related deaths. The southern states, again, are much poorer and therefore less likely to have those resources to adapt to this change. I'd like to look at some impacts that are specific more to the Arctic and Alaska. Most of this information is coming out of the Arctic Climate Change Impact Assessment. Arctic climate change has a number of implications for biodiversity, particularly of our migratory species, because they depend on particular breeding and feeding grounds for their reproduction in the Arctic. Shrinking sea ice habitat for marine animals can impact. Also, our land animals, such as caribou and reindeer, are likely to be facing increased stress due to their food sources changing, breeding grounds, and their migratory routes being interrupted. Tree line is expected to move northward, with forests replacing tundra and tundra vegetation moving into the polar deserts. Insect infestations and outbreaks are likely to increase. Forest fires are expected to increase in frequency, severity, and duration. Increased risk of flooding, thawing permafrost weakens our coastal areas. We've seen this in a number of reports. Because of that, we're going to particularly see communities that need to be relocated. This impacts cultural and societal identity that is dependent upon that particular region, traditional food, and activities which get threatened as we see these communities and their way of life get interrupted. Reduced hunting, travel safety because of shifting ice and weather patterns can all impact those native communities. Shortening period during which ice roads can be traveled, we're already seeing this. Destabilizing of existing buildings, roads, pipelines, airports, all of those major infrastructures. Natural resource changes we're seeing in our wetlands. In fact, the Kenai Peninsula, we're seeing a decrease in our wetlands there, and they're being replaced by forests, actually. Draining lakes and toppling trees. The current generation is likely to receive a much higher lifetime dose of UV rays, and it's expected to be about 30% higher than the current generation. And that has implications for cancer, cataracts, and immune deficiencies. Increased access to Arctic's natural resources, such as offshore extraction of oil and gas, will be available, so we'll see that increase. Part of the problem, though, is there will be some transitional period because of those changing weather patterns and shifting sea ice that could make that exploration more dangerous. All right, continuing on, looking at Alaska overall, we're going to find, first off, we know that Alaska is warming more than other parts of the United States. And as this Arctic Impact Assessment points out, in addition to climate change, areas in Alaska and the Arctic already face a number of challenges to begin with, and so now we're just kind of adding on top of that. We already have air and water contamination, overfishing, increased levels of ultraviolet radiation, habitat alteration, and pollution that we're dealing with. And so climate change just makes all of these issues more difficult to deal with. The spruce budworm and aspen leaf miner and the spruce bark beetle were once pests that were kept in check by our winter cold, but now they're flourishing. It's estimated that we've lost about 4 million acres of forest to these insect outbreaks. The growing season in Fairbanks has increased. It's gone from 80 to 120 days since records were first kept in the 1900s. And that was estimated by John Walsh, who's the director for Center of Global Change in the Arctic System Research here at UAF. The State Accounting Office is also concerned about the cost of moving at-risk communities. It's estimated that there may be more than 100 villages that potentially face damage from those coastal winters storms as they're eroding those shores. They were once protected by that freezing of that shoreline, but since we're finding that that shoreline is freezing later and later, if they get hit by a winter storm, they can see 30 to 40 feet of soil erosion from one storm. If we look at some of the potential economic impacts in Alaska, we can see that if we're looking at land transportation, it's pretty vital to a lot of our communities. That could become disrupted. Disruption to commercial and subsistence harvests of both fish and wildlife. We've seen that our economy has largely been based on a lot of natural resources, oil, gas, minerals, fish, and wildlife. But more and more so, we're seeing that our economy is being impacted by other sectors like tourism and the military sectors. Reduced snow cover can reduce winter recreation opportunities. Increased rainfall and potential flooding may make it a less attractive area for tourism. We can see interruption and increased cost in our transportation sector, particularly if we do find that we have increased regulation. And then our tourism sector could be potentially impacted. This comes from a fairly recent study from UAA, and it was done by Peter Larson and Scott Goldsmith. But one of the major issues in Alaska is our public infrastructure costs, and higher temperatures, melting permafrost, reduction in polar ice, increased flooding are expected to raise the repair and replacement costs of thousands of infrastructure projects. And it's estimated to be upwards of $6.1 billion for and that's estimated to be a 20% increase over the next approximately 20 years. Infrastructure, part of the issue with that is that these aren't small projects. These are things like roads, airports, bridges, sewer systems. And so we have repair costs. We're always doing kind of repair and maintenance on most of these items, but what's going to happen with climate change is that we're going to see that these costs are going to increase. They're going to become even greater, probably upwards of, like I said, an additional $6 billion to the state. So one of the fun things about climate change is uncertainty. We have huge uncertainties facing this issue, and that makes things really, really difficult when we're looking at trying to estimate benefits, costs, and what we call a discount rate. So benefit estimations, if we look at reducing climate change, range from anywhere between $10 and $350 per ton of carbon. So we would receive anywhere from $10 to $350 worth of benefit by reducing a ton of carbon in our atmosphere. That's a huge range. Okay? If we're looking at costs, those range from $10 to $212 per ton of carbon. Again, really large range on our costs. And when looking at costs and benefits over time, we, as economists, discount the future. And we do that using this thing that I've got up here called a discount rate. It's kind of like an interest rate. Oftentimes we use an interest rate as a proxy. But basically, what we consider is that we'd rather have things now, today, than tomorrow. Okay? You'd rather have $1 today than for me to give you $1 sometime in the future. Okay? You can put it in your savings account and save it and earn interest on it. So this is somewhat of the issue that I'm talking about. When we work with things in the future, the very near future, it's fairly easy to guess what an interest rate or a discount rate might be used for that, and it might be appropriate. But when you start stretching things out, like we're going to have to do with climate change, like it's really difficult to estimate what an appropriate rate would be. And the time scale that we're looking at on these things is huge. Most likely the costs that we're going to pay are going to be incurred today or in the very near future. The benefits we receive, however, are going to be far in the future. This is a very difficult thing to sell politically because politicians like to have those benefits today, not in the future. Want the costs in the future, not today. Okay. Let's see here. All right, so let's take a look at some of these uncertainties that we face with this problem. First off, we have an uncertainty in our population. We have some estimates. We think we might know what it's going to be. But as you can see, particularly in the developing countries, maybe, okay? There is probably going to be quite a bit of growth, and again, it's coming out of our developing countries. One of the things with that is as populations grow, we tend to see that industrialization process continue and to increase. And part of the emissions, particularly if we're looking at emissions, it's accelerating. China has now surpassed the US as putting the most emissions or being the biggest producer of greenhouse gases. And environmental regulation tends to be much less stringent in those developing countries versus our developed countries. We also have uncertainty in gross domestic product. This is a lovely term. You've probably heard it in the news that we use as a measure of our standard of living. And it's defined as all of the market value of all the goods and services that we produce in this country in a given year. Those final goods and services, just to be particular. And so one of the things that we know, and I've kind of touched on, is that richer countries, and if you have a greater level of GDP, it indicates that you're richer, is going to allow those countries to better adapt and to deal with an issue like climate change. Another area of uncertainty is in our total emissions. We've got a lot of uncertainty. Where are we going to be? The international distribution of emissions from fossil fuel largely, again, is reflecting that pattern of economic development. And because of greater reliance on subsistence farming and forestry, developing countries currently account for most of the world's carbon dioxide and methane emissions from land use. Even so, on a per capita basis, people in developing countries are responsible for far fewer greenhouse gas emissions than their counterparts in the industrialized countries, and their total emission levels are lower as well. Historically, people in developed countries have emitted roughly 10 times more carbon per person than people in developing countries. And as I've said, China has now exceeded the US as being the largest producer of greenhouse gases, but if you look at part of why they are that, it is production of goods and services, or goods that are sold in the US to this market. Distributional issues. There are lots of distributional issues surrounding this issue. Emission control policies are going to impose costs on people today, yield benefits in the future. Choosing policy involves not only balancing those benefits and costs, but also how we distribute benefits of energy consumption, land use, and climate among our population and our generations. Instead of restricting emissions, current generations could address this problem by adding capital investment to benefit our future generations. So instead of kind of controlling or reducing our emissions currently, another thing that's been put forth is that we could just do capital investment to try and help out these future generations. This has some serious implications, however, and problems. We don't know what's really going to be needed. We don't know the potential damages that are going to come off climate change. We're not sure what kind of compensation would be necessary for those damages. So again, we get into that issue of uncertainty. Within countries, we're going to find that we also have distributional issues. Workers in certain sectors are going to be hit much harder than workers in other economic sectors. So we'll see that certain workers will bear a disproportionate cost of climate change. Certain areas are going to be hit harder in countries. So our southern states will be hit harder than our northern states. If we look at this among countries, then we've got that issue between those developed countries and those developing countries. Developed countries have been responsible for the bulk of emissions to date, but we see these developing countries starting to increase their production as they industrialize and be more of a threat currently. Also, those developing countries get hit hardest by the impacts of climate change. So this was computed out of a general equilibrium model, and I will spare you all the gory details on that, but it's a large mathematical model using simultaneous equations to derive out a general equilibrium. I'll leave it at that. What we're trying to do here is estimate the impacts of climate change on investment, our capital stock, which is our physical capital, things like buildings, roads, factories, equipment, labor, and our consumption within the U.S. And one of the things that this gets based on is the amount of adaptation that we undertake. And adaptation is an attempt to limit adverse impacts from climate change. So maybe we change the types of crops. We get more heat-tolerant crop varieties that we use. That would be a form of adaptation. So we have two scenarios. We've got one that's optimistic and one that's pessimistic. The optimistic assumes optimal adaptation and low potential damages. So we're investing a lot in our adaptation, and therefore we have low damages. The pessimistic assumes that we really don't do any adaptation. We're not taking any actions, and therefore we face high potential damages in the future. As you can see, even in the optimistic case, just over 2 degrees Celsius, and here I know I've said it a couple of times, but here's that key again, that threshold of 2 degrees Celsius, we're going to see this decline. And what this is measuring is that GDP, or our standard of living, the amount of goods and services that our country produces within a given year within our border. In the pessimistic case, global warming causes negative impacts on GDP initially, okay, right off the bat. So with that optimistic case and that adaptation, we might actually see our GDP continue, our standard of living continue to rise for a certain period of time, even as we get warmer, but not with our negative case. But in both of these cases, it's largely driven from changes in agricultural prices, and then also some contribution, but to a lesser extent, in energy prices and mortality. So, I had a question up earlier, and it's asked, take action now or wait. And basically what's being concluded, particularly out of the Stern Review, is that the benefits of strong early action on climate change outweigh its cost. And it's kind of like, if you take action sooner, then you're more likely to be able to make changes. You're going to have more resources to work with currently. So emissions have been and continue to be driven by our economic growth. Stabilization of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is feasible and consistent with continued growth. So we can still have economic development and growth even as we start to mitigate these greenhouse gas concentrations. North America and Europe have produced around 70% of all the CO2 emissions due to energy production, while developing countries have accounted for less than 1/4 of those emissions. And stabilization at whatever level requires that annual emissions be brought down to a level that balances the Earth's natural capacity to remove greenhouse gases from our atmosphere. It's estimated that if we have our annual cost of stabilization, so as we bring down those greenhouse gases and stabilize them, will be about 1% of our GDP by 2050. Now, our GDP currently is in the trillions of dollars, so 1% is not a minor figure, but it is doable, it's feasible, it's significant, but it is manageable. And the earlier we take action, the more effective it can be and the lower the costs will be in the future. Reducing emissions, greenhouse emissions can be cut mainly in 4 ways. And our costs are going to depend on which ones of these we choose. If we're looking at taking action, there's some things that will be far less costly than other things. So action to prevent further deforestation is relatively cheap versus some other types of mitigation programs that we can use. Large-scale uptake of range of clean power, heat, and transport technologies is going to be required if we're going to have radical emission reductions in the medium to long term. Some of these technologies are still being processed, and so that's why we're moving it out of the short term and into the medium and long term. Most likely we will need to see deep cuts in our transportation sector. That's much more difficult in the short term, but much more likely to be feasible if we stretch that time frame out. And what we're going to find is that as we do these energy efficient measures, it often cuts waste and ends up saving us money in the long run. And so if we're cutting emissions, we can reduce the demand for emission intensive goods. So we move out of those carbon intensive goods and into less intensive goods. We can increase our efficiency of our goods. We can take action on non-energy emissions such as deforestation, and then switching to those low carbon technologies. So one of the things, like I said, that this is a market failure. So to correct for a market failure, a market failure indicates that the market's not likely to take care of it itself. And so we need that collective action. And so because of that, I wanted to go through a few of our policy measures. We have a number of different things that we can implement. Carbon pricing, which is usually going to be done through an emissions tax. We could also set up some sort of trade or regulation that properly prices our carbon. Greenhouse gases, again, are what we would call an externality. And so the producers of these gases typically are not paying the full price of their actions. And so one of the things we do with a tax is we can adjust that price. By adding that tax on, it changes the price of that good. And we need to put that appropriate price on carbon so that decision makers face their full cost of their actions. When we do that, our market will be efficient. We can see that those decision makers will then factor that into their decision and will come out at that socially optimal output level that we looked at the graph earlier. Economic efficiency, economists love this solution because it upholds the principle of economic efficiency because they're going to occur where we find those cheapest ways to make them happen. Technology policy, that's really going to be research and development. And I'm not sure if anyone's aware, but the U.S. research and development budget has been falling, for federal funding has been going down, not up. So, costs of technologies also tend to fall as we gain a larger scale and widespread acceptance. So we find that our technologies, and we see this even with consumer technologies, tend to start out very high, but then become much cheaper as we get that widespread acceptance. Many low carbon technologies currently are much more expensive than our fossil fuel options, but as we gain that acceptance and that increase in our technology, we'll find typically that those prices will fall. Removal of barriers, we're talking about is barriers for preventing action, such as the lack of reliable information. We really need to have as much and the best information that we can possibly have. Reducing those transaction costs that I discussed earlier, changing behavioral and organizational inertia to this problem, i.e. starting to take action. And policies can really have a large impact in our markets. Labeling, sharing of best practices, minimum standards for such things as building and appliances, financing measures, education to shape future policy can all impact where we end up with this problem. This is kind of my end on an optimistic standpoint or attempt to with this problem, because I think it often gets framed as very gloom and doom. And one of the things is we transition to a lower carbon economy that really brings about challenges, but it also brings about opportunities for growth. And in economics, we're all about weeding out efficiency. Efficiency typically is what we focus on because it's nice and it's easy. We can define it. We can mathematically model it. We know when we're efficient and when we're not. We have lots of definitions for it. Our other main economic goal is equity, which is fairness, and that's really fuzzy, and economists tend to usually try and avoid that whole issue. But climate change can really help us root out inefficiencies that are existing in our current system. And if we look at this at a company level, implementing climate change oftentimes draws attention to money-saving opportunities. So as a business implements these new technologies, maybe they drop their costs, their energy use costs or some other costs overall. At an economy level, when we're looking at the entire nation or potentially the entire world, then climate change, again, may help us reform inefficient systems that we have in place and potentially remove those market distortions that we currently see. This is my references, which are fairly small, I'm sure, and I will take questions from the audience.
Oh. I was wondering if we're going to see any of these changes during our lifetime.
Yes, I think we will. Most certainly. Probably during, I would say, most people's lifetime. You know, we're already seeing an increase in you know, climate and like overall state temperatures, at least as far as Alaska, and also globally too. And you know, things like we'll at least see some impacts, such as you know, increased fires, increased outbreak of insect infestation, these types of things for certain.
I agree, we've seen some change since I was in grade school and all, but we've cleared more land and had a lot more energy in the valley. I don't really think it'll make any difference in my lifetime. Thank you.
Any other questions?
You mentioned a possibility of a 30% increase. I'm over here to your right. 30% increase in ultraviolet emissions.
Yes.
What's the mechanism there? Why would a warmer climate mean that there's more ultraviolet radiation from the sun?
A thinning of the ozone allows more of the UV through.
One of the impacts of increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that I've heard a number of scientists talk about recently is the acidification of the ocean. And intuitively, I would think that would have some kind of impact on fisheries and many other things. Have you heard anything that along that line from the economic point of view?
I haven't, but I mean, anytime you change an ecosystem, which most of them tend to be pretty delicate and finely balanced, we'll see a decrease. If you know, one of the things is if we have decreased fish stocks, and most of our fisheries are overfished at the moment anyway, it just makes it harder and harder to access that resource, that natural resource, and that is an increase in production costs from an economic standpoint. The other thing is, if you're looking at something like a fishery, if you get to the point where it collapses, then you no longer have that fishery at all. You have depleted that resource completely. And that can have huge implications, particularly if you start looking at societal and cultural implications in that as, on top of the economic problems.
My name is Mike Pippinger, and I'm head of the economics department at UAF, and I'd like to welcome you to Fairbanks from the economics department as well as the School of Management. One of the things that I've been trying to explain to my students in international economics has to do with the approach to climate change and how to deal with that issue. And currently the United States has sugar quotas. That's primarily to protect corn. And that's why we have corn syrup in most of our soda and other products that need sweetener. We also have price supports for corn. We have a whole industry of corn syrup production. And now we have a subsidy of ethanol,
Yes.
which is, in effect, a subsidy for corn production. Now, my family's in farming, so growing high price of corn is probably a good thing for me. But the funny thing is, it causes the price of corn tortillas to go up in Mexico. It's a very complicated issue, government policy is. And there are two aspects to government policy, I think, today. One has to do with government standard macroeconomic policy as well as microeconomic policies. The other issue has to do with global warming. In terms of macroeconomic policies, the question is, can the government control GDP or per capita GDP? In terms of the climate change issue, can governments control CO2 levels in the atmosphere? That is, control the world ecosystem. From a neoclassical point of view, your discussion is quite thorough. If you want to, anyone interested in a non-neoclassical discussion of government policy could use, say, a book by Friedrich von Hayek, either The Road to Serfdom or a more recent book, The Fatal Conceit. What's your take on this simple protection of sugar, corn price supports, causing corn tortillas to go up in price in Mexico?
I think, well, I mean, you know, if we don't have a market failure, then obviously from a neoclassical standpoint, we ought to stay out of the market. Otherwise, we distort that market. And I think, you know, it's a complex issue. It's, you know, so corn prices and ethanol, and is this even a feasible solution? Should we be involved in that? It is driving up, you know, prices of corn products. It's driving up, even more indirectly, cattle feed. So price of beef increases and all of those fun things. And so the economy it's all, well, I don't know if I can say it's all connected, but most of it's connected. And as we have increased this global economy, then we have those impacts, such as our laws on sugar, which are basically ridiculous, but I won't even go down that road. Increasing corn tortillas in Mexico. I think first off, I don't know that government alone can be the only solution. No, probably not. First off, we have to get them to do something in the first place about it, which is going to be a bit of a challenge. Secondly, though, I don't know that they have the reach, and it's going to take more than just collective action or that government action to really probably solve the problem. And I don't know that, I guess one of my other issues with government is I don't know that they would be creative enough to solve this, and we're really going to need, I think, a lot of creativity involved in solving this problem in the future. So I hope that addresses your problem, Michael. Or Ruth. Yeah, I'm not sure I know. I have little faith in the government, so I try to remain optimistic, but it's difficult. So. Other questions?
Hi, this is almost a segue. It's on that same kind of point, and it touches exactly on what you're saying. Given that there's momentum to global society, and we want them to change radically, and especially if there's both confusion and dissension about what the causes are, although things appear to be getting warmer, is it best to invest in mitigation, or possibly a portion that needs to go to adaptation, which would be valuable no matter what the cause is?
If you look at like the recommendations in the Stern review, it's that we have to have both. We do need to start focusing on that mitigation and taking those steps to reduce and stabilize the emission flow. At the same time, we're still going to need, I mean, we're warming, and even if we were to stabilize today, we would still be warming for a certain period in the future, so we're still going to need those adaptation measures also. So both.
I just wanted a little clarification on the Stern report that you quoted quite often. Who were the authors and what was the original purpose of the study?
I can't remember the author's first name. His last name is Stern. He's a British economist. If you Google Stern Review, it'll most certainly pop up. You can download the entire, I think it's like 400 to 600 page report off of the internet. But he was a British economist looking at kind of this, trying to have a comprehensive view of climate change. So, was there another question in that I missed? Oh, he works for the British government. I'm not sure exactly what organization within the British government, but he's an economist for the British government. One more back here. Okay.
I had a question that one of the things that we could do to help is if the U.S. government would put money into helping to prevent population. You know, a lot of these countries would love to have contraceptives and they can't. It's out of their reach. The other thing is what can we do? You talked about deforestation, but they have now just opened up the Tongas. You know, I mean, is there anything that we can do about that?
Well, politically, you know, you always have the option of harassing your representatives. Yeah, the one issue I think with population that we need to clarify is that yes, there probably does need to be a stabilization of population. The issue though is more within consumption patterns. And if you look at, most of the population is in developing countries. Now as they industrialize and start to emulate our Western lifestyle, it's going to become more and more issue with them having larger populations. But what really gets down to it is that we consume, the industrialized 20% population of the industrialized world consumes 80% of the resources, the world's resources. And so one of the, probably something even more important would be for us to reduce our consumption patterns, would be probably more important. Also, what's happening is China and India want to emulate our lifestyles, you know, 1 to 2 cars per house and driving everywhere and, you know, the big house and all the goods inside of it and that thing. And that's where we really see, it takes energy and produces emissions for everything we produce. Right. Most of the European countries are far more advanced in their technologies than what we're actually adopting. They're much more likely to have a mass transit and use it and, you know, a lot of those things. So, yeah.
We're going to take one more right here.
Thank you for your presentation. You know, there still is a question as to what is actually causing global warming. And the scientific community questions, at least many of them, very renowned scientists question whether CO2 is actually causing the problem, and that it appears as if we're in sort of a panic mode. I think we need to really take a good look at what is actually causing the global warming and whether mankind is going to be able to control it. Scientific fact has proven that global warming and cooling has occurred over eons of years, and I have a real concern as to whether we are panicking ourselves into a mode of economic and social ruin without having proper scientific facts to prove what's going on.
I think that as far as peer-reviewed scientific articles, the consensus is coming down most certainly that there is warming. What the cause is may still be under somewhat of a debate, but the fact is we're warming. If we're warming, we're going to face some of these issues. Stern Review, if you look at taking action early versus taking action later, finds that the cost of mitigating that will be cheaper if you take the action earlier. I think also one of the things, as I pointed out, is oftentimes we can weed out these inefficiencies. And so there are, I think this often gets painted as this gloom and doom, but if we invest and weed out inefficiencies, develop better technologies, overall our economy will be more competitive.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.